my name's Dundon, and today I will be presenting the little-known Soviet moonshot that couldn't. The moon landing. We know the story. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon with the words, "One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." And in December 1972, Gene Cernan set foot off the moon and left, the last of only 12 men to have ever walked on the moon. And that's a story we'll remember, bits and pieces of at least. But did you know that America was not the only player in the game? From the 1950s onwards, the US and the Soviet Union were engaged in the space race, a fierce competition deeply entrenched in the iconography of the Cold War, where each achievement scored was not only a convenient showcase of the very same rocket technology that formed the basis of the nuclear arms race, but treated as yet another absolute proof of the superiority of their entire ideological system. The Soviet launch of Sputnik, the world's first satellite, in October 1957, took the West by complete surprise. The US's very televised response, affectionately nicknamed Flopnik, didn't do much to inspire public confidence. And the USSR quickly followed Sputnik up with the first probes to visit the Moon, Mars, and Venus, the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first spacewalk, the first robotic moon rovers, the first robotic sample return to Earth, the first space station, a whole fleet of them, in fact, when in all that time the US only managed one. The Soviet lead seemed untouchable. So even when US President John F. Kennedy pledged to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out, it seemed inevitable that the Soviets would be the first to do that too. So what happened? How did they not only lose the moon race, but not even put someone there second? Did they not even try at all? The Soviet government was content to let people think so, but the collapse of the regime in 1991 brought with it a mass declassification of top-secret documents that revealed an astonishing truth. The USSR were pursuing an ambitious manned lunar program of their own. And it wasn't just theoretical. Designed around a behemoth of a rocket, even more powerful than the American similarly colossal Saturn V, the Soviet moon program got far enough along to enter full production and flight testing. 4 such rockets and other hardware like the lunar lander were built to completion. In fact, their second moon rocket launch was ready to go 3 weeks before Apollo 11. And if there's anyone who could make it work, it was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, leader of OKB-1, the very first of what will become a network of hundreds of specialized design bureaus tasked with aerospace research and development for the Soviet military-industrial complex post-World War II. He was of such strategic importance that until after his death, he was only ever referred to either by his initials SP or by the title of chief designer, for fear that Western powers would assassinate him to sabotage Soviet missile development. A colorful character with a cynical sense of humor whose favorite expression was "chlopnut bez nekrologa," or "we're all going to be shot and there will be no obituary," Korolev was the man most responsible for the Soviet Union's spaceflight successes. His OR-7 rocket was the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile and was used to launch Sputnik. His Vostok spacecraft made Yuri Gagarin the first man in space in 1961. His Voskhod spacecraft made Alexei Leonov the first person to perform a spacewalk in 1965. His Soyuz spacecraft, which first entered service in the late 60s, continues to fly to this day. All of them launched on his OR-7 rockets and subsequent modifications, which, since they became known as the Soyuz rocket family, have gone on to make over 1,900 flights, making them the most frequently used launch vehicles in the world. Korolev was the de facto head of the Soviet space program. His administrative power made him like a one-man NASA. But he was forced to work within the strict confines of the Soviet system. In the early days of the space race, post-Stalin Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had little interest in funneling huge sums of money into civilian spaceflight, more interested in developing ICBMs for the military's strategic rocket forces. So in order to get approval for the space exploration projects for which he was so passionate, Korolev had to come up with a crafty workaround. Sputnik's OR-7 rocket, built to fulfill the military's request for a new ICBM, just coincidentally also meeting all the criteria necessary for orbital launches, so conveniently that they might as well greenlight a satellite launch for cheap and easy propaganda points. Gagarin's Vostok, also launched on a cheap and easy modification of the OR-7, was itself built to meet military demands for a recoverable spy satellite. The entire Soviet space program, even at its peak, had only 1/10 the annual budget the US dedicated to just the Apollo program. What's more, while the US coordinated all its space efforts through a single core agency, NASA, Soviet spaceflight remained split among dozens of separate design bureaus, so Korolev had to continuously compete against rival designers. Although he wanted the moon missions for himself, in 1960 the job was given to Vladimir Chelomey because his design bureau happened to employ Sergei, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's son. But Chelomey's lack of experience and Soviet leadership's general lack of interest meant progress was slow. While Apollo had already started work in 1961, after Kennedy designated a moon landing an urgent national priority, it took Korolev 3 years to convince party leadership to even start work on a response, with a 1964 decree finally ordering a 1967 landing to both beat the Americans and commemorate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. Uh-oh, what's next? Oh yeah, and far from freeing him from Chelomey, the 1964 decree instead divvied up responsibility for the moon missions between the two, giving Korolev the moon landing, while tasking Chelomey with launching a more achievable lunar flyby even sooner with his smaller UR-500 rocket. Where the American Apollo program followed a logical progression of hardware development where each intermediate step, like a lunar flyby, would progressively introduce and test the technologies required for the eventual landing, this counterproductive arrangement meant the USSR was splitting its already slim funding between two completely incompatible systems that provided no useful training data for one another. In order to lift the 95-ton payload weight required for a lunar landing, the N-1 moon rocket designed by Korolev would need engines larger and more powerful than any before. Valentin Glushko was the USSR's leading engine designer and specialized in making rocket engines that used hypergolic fuels, chemicals that spontaneously ignite on contact with one another. They're storable at room temperature, making them convenient for military uses. But they're also incredibly toxic and corrosive, something Korolev was wary of approving for manned flights. The Nedelin disaster of 1960 was still fresh in his mind, when just a few years earlier, a hypergolic-fueled Or-16 rocket exploded on the pad and killed over 70 people, including Mitrofan Nedelin, the commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces. Instead, Korolev wanted to use the cryogenic fuels of liquid oxygen and kerosene, which need to be kept extremely cold in order to stay liquids, something that makes them inconvenient for military uses in ICBMs, but perfect for the high-efficiency needs of space travel. There was also a personal problem between the two. Korolev blamed Glushko for denouncing him during Stalin's Great Purges in 1938, which led to his near death serving 6 years in the brutal labor camp at Kolyma. Glushko, for his part, considered Korolev to be irresponsibly cocky and autocratic in the way he micromanaged things far outside his area of expertise. Glushko outright refused to work with Korolev, who was forced to find a new engine designer and eventually gave the job to Nikolai Kuznetsov, a leading jet engine designer, but who had never built rockets before. While Apollo had the funding and corporate support to commit to rigorous ground testing at every stage in development, their underfunded Soviet counterparts couldn't spare the resources necessary to set up such extensive new testing facilities, not to mention the production infrastructure necessary to accommodate incredibly large engines. So Kuznetsov's engineers took the design in a different direction. Rather than using 5 simple but large engines, like the Saturn V's first stage, the N-1 moon rocket used 30 smaller but more efficient engines. Using so many smaller engines meant the N-1 was able to generate far more thrust than the Saturn V. To this day, it remains the most powerful rocket ever flown. But increased complexity always brings increased chance of failure. When all it takes is one engine exploding to cause a fatal chain reaction, having 30 instead of 5 is 6 times the number of things that could go wrong. And just as work started on the new engines, in January 1966, Sergei Korolev died, aged only 59. For years, he'd been suffering serious health problems originating from his time in the brutal conditions of the Kolyma Gulag, only further aggravated by his intense workload. Though doctors had warned him that if he continued pushing himself so hard, he wouldn't live much longer, Korolev refused to slow down, convinced that Soviet leadership only entertained the space program for its propaganda value and wouldn't hesitate to cancel it entirely if they started losing their lead over the Americans. His death was a devastating blow to the entire Soviet space program. While the Soviet loss of the moon race might appear to have been a failure against all odds given their previous run of achievements, the truth is the program was faced with obstacles at every level, from subpar resources to a repressive political system that meant it was down to individuals' passion, talent, and self-sacrifice to progress that science, with all those early missions having succeeded against all odds. The task of seeing the N1 through to completion fell to Vasily Mishin, Korolev's deputy. But although he was a competent engineer, Mishin was inexperienced, and he didn't have the political savvy nor the formidable reputation of his old boss. Korolev's old rivals Glushko and Chalamet took the chance to repeatedly campaign to the Kremlin for the approval of their alternate moon landing plan, to cancel the N1 entirely and use their own completely different rocket, the hypergolic UR-700. But their bids were unsuccessful. The moon landing program was still beholden to the unrealistic launch schedule set out in the 1964 approval decree, so N1s were rushed into production to meet the earliest possible launch dates, already delayed to 1969. The rocket was still in development by the time of the launches, with failures expected as part of this trial and error process. To manage the N1's unwieldy number of engines, a computer control system known as CORD, control of rocket engines, was hastily scrambled together. If an engine failed, CORD would shut down the engine on the opposite side to maintain balance. It could do this for any pair of engines, with the N1 capable of limping to orbit even with as many as 4 engines shut down. The first launch finally happened in February of 1969, the first time that all N1 systems were tested together. Apollo 8 had already flown the first humans around the moon in December, so Chalamet's flyby program was cancelled. It was all on the N1 now. Only a few seconds into the launch, engine vibrations ruptured fuel lines, starting a fire which tripped CORD into shutting down all 30 engines 68 seconds into the flight. The rocket crashed 52 kilometers from the pad. The attempt revealed that CORD had serious problems. Vladimir Barmin, the engineer in charge of the N1's launch infrastructure, suggested modifications, fearing an incident while the rocket was still over the pad. But there was no time to make changes that big, so Barmin agreed not to mention the possibility in front of higher-ups. With fingers crossed, the second launch was prepared for July 3rd, 1969. As the N1 cleared the launch tower, engine number 8 exploded, starting a fire which triggered a CORD shutdown of all 30 engines. Well, all engines except one, 30 seconds into the flight. The sole remaining engine caused the N1 to tip over at a 45-degree angle as it fell back onto the launch pad, causing a massive explosion. Eyewitness Semyon Komarovsky described it like this: "Today I saw, without exaggeration, the end of the world, and not in a nightmare, but while fully awake and standing right next to it. Windows shattered 35 kilometers away, while terrified onlookers saw a huge red and black mushroom cloud pierce the night sky. 30 minutes later, there were still droplets of unburnt kerosene raining from the sky. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. And as big as the explosion was, up to 85% of the fuel on board didn't even detonate. The launch facilities, though, were completely leveled. The twin launch pads in close proximity, well, they made for lovely photo opportunities, but the N1 now had no intact launch infrastructure. The USSR had no intact launch infrastructure for their already overdue moon rocket, and it would take over a year and a half to rebuild. 17 days later, Apollo 11 made Neil Armstrong the first man on the moon. The third launch finally happened in June 1971, and for the first time, all 30 engines fired successfully, which was the cause of this flight's failure. The simultaneous... Okay, well, I guess we just don't have a video for that one. The simultaneous firing of all 30 engines caused unexpected aerodynamic effects that made the rocket rotate beyond its ability to regain control. The rocket's high-speed rotation tore it apart. Wow. Okay, well, Launch number 4, right. The fourth launch in November 1972 went almost perfectly. It flew higher and further than all 3 previous attempts, up until just 15 seconds from the scheduled first stage separation, when the planned shutdown of the 6 inside engines to reduce pressure on the rocket's structure at such high speed caused a shockwave that vibrated through the rocket, burst fuel lines, and started a fire, triggering a cord shutdown of all 30 engines after engine number 4 exploded. If ground controllers had acted fast and manually initiated an early second stage ignition and separation, the rocket could have made it to orbit regardless. But by T plus 107 seconds, the rocket started to disintegrate, meaning this fourth and final flight also broke up and crashed into the desert below. The only part of the N1 that consistently worked across all 4 launches was the launch escape system, which pulled the empty crew modules to safety and parachuted them down to a landing every single time. The N1, had it ever actually successfully flown a mission, was actually going to be publicly designated the communism rocket, which is incredible considering just how representative its entire production history is of literally everything wrong with Soviet communism. Though a 5th N1 was nearly complete, with engineers sure this one had finally worked out all the kinks of the design, by this point the Americans had beaten the Soviets to every possible impressive moon milestone. Morale was at an all-time low, and justification for further funding had completely evaporated. So the program was suspended in 1974 and quietly cancelled in 1976. All physical evidence was destroyed, and it was relegated to secrecy. Scrap was used for barns and gazebos around the launch site, and the USSR refocused its space efforts on a series of Earth orbital space stations as a consolation prize. It was a colossal and resounding failure. So colossal, in fact, that second N1 launch caused what was at the time, and what remains to this day, one of the largest man-made non-nuclear explosions in history, which is not unlike what I did to your mom last night. Against all odds and in a formal setting, that was the longest your mom joke in the world. Thank you.